Good PCE number today. The probably gets the Fed to go sooner rather than later from the politicalization of the Fed, going or cutting into an election year. What do you think? They're better off doing it early versus right around the election? And how much of this is going to be, looked at as you're just trying to help out the cause?
Well, I think the usual suspects will say that it's, they're trying to help out Biden. But I don't really see that. I mean, everyone knows that I've been saying March for over a month. I mean, politics doesn't enter into our sort of thinking around the Fed, but it's important for people to know that the Fed's been projecting cuts for 2024 since June of 2022. So that's in their dots. It's been there for a while. I mean, it's not exactly new information. And projecting cuts or more cuts, which is what they've done recently, that's also not especially unusual either. I mean, that's what you'd expect to see, right? Inflation's coming in lower than they thought. Unemployment's come up a little bit. You put all these things into a standard Taylor rule model, and it spits out about 3 cuts. And I think
So
what's
Steve,
important is
yeah. Well, I was just going to say,
the
Steve,
Fed's not
historically,
projecting more, right? I mean, it's not like the Fed's projecting more than the markets.
right. So, Steve, historically, the Fed, probably wants to sit on their hands. Right now, it appears that the data is supportive enough. How influential do you see this in terms of not only Powell's history, but the history of the Fed as well?
Well, I think Neil's right. I mean, sort of whatever they do, they're going to be criticized by whatever political party thinks it hurts them. So you'll have Republicans argue if the Fed starts to cut rates closer to the election day next year, that's sort of putting the thumb on the scale for Biden. If they don't maybe go as far as the market suggests, then Democrats will criticize them for trying to favor Trump over Biden. So sort of in a no-win situation there from the optics. I guess you just sort of have to go into, is the Fed thinking about those optics? Does that sort of influence maybe when they might want to go? I don't know that there's any definitive way to know that without sitting in the room. When I look at Fed Chair Jerome Powell, I know there's been a lot of criticism over him maybe waiting to receive his nomination for a second go here as chair from Biden before really pivoting to addressing the transitory concern. He may have made his decision more difficult and have to respond more aggressively as part of that. Neil would know more about that than I would. And I guess, I would just reference what John F. Kennedy, author of Profiles in Courage, said, that there was a reason there were only 8 chapters. It's just because there are very few examples of it in Washington, D.C.
Well, I would give Powell a D, maybe a D minus for, where he was in 2020. But I got to say, I mean, I'm in the B plus camp for how he's handled this, the soft landing, sticking it, using the power of the pulpit and, where he's been in terms of the forward guidance and then reacting accordingly. What will be interesting, right, is if he cuts early, that's going to be more helpful to the economy later than if he waits and does it, even though the optics might look worse if he's cutting in August or even September, for God's
Right. If
sakes.
you wanted to help him, he wouldn't have been hiking recently because that's going to be felt, I mean, well, if you really believe in lags. But the other thing, of course, is that it's not just the Fed, right? EM central banks have already started cutting. I mean, the Bank of England, are they trying to bail out Rishi Sunak in January of 2025? I mean, they have an election coming up not long after we have one.
They're not an island unto themselves.
Yeah, and I would just say that it was actually Chris Waller, who was a Trump appointee, that really let the toothpaste out of the tube. Right? He basically said that if inflation keeps slowing like this for a few more months, we'll cut. The reason I started saying March was because of something he said, and he was a Trump appointee. So I just think it's like the Fed's sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't. But
well, they're everybody's punching bag. They're easy.
Exactly.
They're easy.
It's like parlor sport. But as I say, like ultimately, what the folks that are most critical of the Fed right now for cutting and potentially in 2024, what they're most upset about, let's just be honest, it's that inflation is coming in lower than they thought, right? I mean, they put all their eggs in the food and energy and like in that basket, and now it's turning around, and so they're upset about it.
Yeah. All right, let's get going. Welcome to Random Off Script, where we openly discuss markets, economics, policy, history, and life. It's the 22nd of December, 2023. I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Detta.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
As a reminder, all the charts that we reference are posted to our Twitter account at RedMac LLC and our LinkedIn page. And if you are listening and you want deeper insight, but you're not an institutional client, then go to redmacaccess.com. That's redmacaccess.com. It's a site that we provide some of the insights to the work that we're doing here on a regular basis. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about animal spirits along with that escape velocity from last week. We're going to talk about the latest PCE, that's personal consumption, housing, CFO optimism, the ruling out of Colorado, and what's going on with U.S. Steel and the importance there. But let's start with the PCE. That's the most latest data or figure, Neil, was pretty good. What was your take on that number?
Well, I would just look at the 10-year yield, Jeff. It round tripped. We're actually where we started the year. What else do you need to know? That tells you about what's going on with inflation. In November, headline inflation actually fell 0.1%, and that's after it came in flat in October. Over the last 3 months, headline inflation rose 1.4% at an annual rate. Core inflation, when you strip out food energy, up 0.1% in November, below expected. That follows 0.1% in October. Over the last 3, up 2.2%. Over the last 6, up 1.9% at an annual rate. So over the last 6 months, core inflation, for all the talk about it being a bumpy road back to 2, it's stickier, we've actually already been at sub 2% inflation now for the last 6 months. When you look at things like core services, X housing, so services X energy housing, sort of this key component that the Fed has been looking at, that rose just 0.1% in November and 0.1% in October. And it's been below 2% annualized for 3 of the last 4 months. So I think for the Fed, when you look at what they've done historically and what they're likely to do going forward, they're already there. I mean, typically at the onset of a Fed easing, you see the unemployment rate up at least 0.3% from its low. We're there. The low was 3.4. We're at 3.7. And core inflation on average is around 2.5% in the preceding 3 months before the cut. And we've been doing that for a while. So you could argue actually that the Fed may have maybe overdoing it, if anything. But I do think the die is cast for them to go. I think they're going in March. I think they won't be going as much as the markets think. Because if you look at the inflation data, one of the reasons why it fell so sharply is because core goods, things, like furniture and cars, that fell quite sharply, 0.4% over the month, and it's been falling quite rapidly, over the last, 5 or 6 months. It's hard to see that lasting, particularly if consumer demand for goods picks up. I mean, consumers are still spending money. So, in some respect, you could maybe argue that the disinflation that we're seeing is transitory, and that may be a reason for the Fed not to go as much as the markets think. But that doesn't mean that they won't be going at all.
Yeah, so clearly, from a timing perspective, this is going to work out pretty well for 2024. How many times do you think that they're going to go? The market's saying 6. You think what? 3, 4?
I think you could talk me into 4 at most, but I think 3 is my base case. I think it's sort of a surgical strike, and that kind of resets the economy. But they're not really trying to provide additional sort of mana to the economy. They just want to keep it on an even keel. And that's why it's not really an aggressive rate cutting cycle. And I think that's part of the challenge, I think, for a lot of investors, is that we're not really used to seeing the Fed surgically cut interest rates. It's usually an all or nothing kind of thing, right? So, if you look at previous rate cutting cycles, I mean, the Fed's taking rates to 1%, 0, but whatever we're going through right now isn't the sort of like asset boom and bust cycle of those recessions. This is sort of essentially what you could say is a recalibration of policy. And that's why we've been saying that this is, no 2 periods are alike, but the most, in our view, the most obvious historical analog is like the 1995 experience.
What's the PCE number that worries them, do you think?
what's the PCE number that worries them?
Yeah.
I don't know that it's a specific number. It's more about the trajectory,
Yeah, I mean, if
right?
you think if we're running lower than what 175, do you think that starts to amp up their concerns or not?
Yeah, what they've overshot on inflation.
Yeah,
I think they're already concerned. That's why they're
yeah,
telling you that they're thinking about cuts.
yeah. Interesting. Optimism, CFO optimism was good last week. You had a couple of things on Twitter. I know that you posted regarding housing. So all this is feeding through in kind of the traditional way you'd expect, right?
Yeah, I mean, interest rates are down, mortgage rates are down. That's supporting housing. The consumer confidence number. I don't think anyone. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that one out. I mean, gas prices are down, stock prices are up, mortgage rates are down, your real incomes are up. I mean, what do you expect people to do? I mean, it is kind of funny and ironic how everyone's talking about the vibes and consumers don't feel, and then you have like the biggest upside surprise in consumer confidence in like a year and a half, right? Like so, um, it's just one of these things where I mean, it's just funny to sometimes listen to what the discussions are versus what actually is going on. But consumers are starting to respond. At least in confidence data, confidence is moving up and to the right.
And would you pay for gas in New Jersey of all places?
I just saw it for under $3, $2.99. And remember, in New Jersey, that comes with the added benefit of not even having to fill it yourself. And
Yeah,
considering how cold it is outside these days, I mean, that's a nice perk.
yeah.
So,
Well, you
well,
wouldn't
we
want to
make
get.
up for it on the insurance side. I will just be, I mean, yes, our gas is cheaper than New York, but ever since I've moved, the insurance premiums have been through the roof.
Well, it's probably why I've seen you drive.
It's not me, it's
So,
the owners that are on the policy.
so speaking of animal spirits, we had that confirmation last week with the 20-day highs and the follow through and the historical precedents. It was the seventh time since 1957 that we've had it. In the other six instances, equities have been higher in each instance out the next 3 and 6 months. So good things usually follow on that momentum, which is great. The one thing that you want to, concern yourself with, or at least keep a finger on the pulse of, is really the animal spirits. Or do people become too exuberant? Do they get over their skis in terms of their expectations for for forward returns? We put a chart out, which is just a SPAC index, right? So the special purpose acquisition companies that were, all the rage 3 or 4 years ago, which were clearly, I mean, almost like couldn't script it better, the definition of a bubble. And we've seen the outcome, and it ended in tears with all that liquidity, as it usually does. But it is starting to break out. You are starting to see some improvement in some of those SPACs, and we threw a Twitter poll out there asking if it was just kind of a normal resumption in risk tolerance, or if it was a resumption of a speculative mania. 55% actually thought it was speculative mania, which would be more in line with those animal spirits. But there's a couple other things that we look at to get an idea of that. Sure, the Consensus Inc. data is elevated in terms of the sentiment polls for the S&P, but it's really just not that consistent. And keep in mind that high levels of enthusiasm or bullishness don't tend to be as bearish as low levels of enthusiasm are bullish, right? In other words, there's asymmetry. It works better at bottoms than it does at tops. But a couple things that we look for, just to give you a sense. One is, what's the performance of low price names in the Russell 3000? How many or what percentage of names are below $5, and what's their performance? Where we are today, really middle of the road. It doesn't say anything that certainly they picked up, but it certainly doesn't say anything about the excesses of speculative activity. The second is what we call trash versus treasure. What's happening to high short interest names that have a lot of debt, that are also very volatile, versus the exact opposite names on the other side. And certainly those names, the trash is picking up, it's outperforming the treasure, but again, not to a point where we'd be more concerned, or shows the excessiveness. And the same thing with negative free cash flow. How many of these names that have negative free cash flow are beating those with the highest free cash flow? And again, it's picking up, but it's certainly not excessive. So I do think that's something to keep an eye on. I do think it's something that can become a problem. Maybe it's even in the first quarter, but I just don't think it's here. And so, as we kind of check through our boxes of animal spirits and say, all right, how high do you have to get with these things before it really becomes a problem? I just don't think that we're there yet. So good news as far as I'm concerned for the equity markets, that That acceleration, that escape velocity is a sign of breadth. That's a sign of health. That should actually be good news for small cap versus large cap as well. Steve, let's hit the elephant in the room. I am in the great state of Colorado here, not to double check on the Supreme Court, but obviously a big ruling keeping Trump off the ballot. I'm a due process guy. I think it's kind of reprehensible. I think it's actually not kind of, it is reprehensible when you go outside the purview of due process. I don't care who you are, where you are, what side of the aisle you're on. I think it's just due process is kind of what we live by. He hasn't even been charged with insurrection, right? So how do you keep him off the ballot when he hasn't even really officially been charged? And he hasn't been charged, by the way, because the prosecutors know what a high bar that is. And so they'd rather get him on the other things, which I totally get. I mean, it is a game. But how do you do this? And it's got to be headed toward the Supreme Court. And then the question is, how quickly and what does that look like?
Well, I'll preface this with I'm not a lawyer, but I've spoken with people who are. And I think you're probably right identifying that the due process or lack thereof in this case is probably going to be the thing that the Trump legal team brings to the Supreme Court. My guess is that they'll probably be successful in that. If you look at sort of the politics involved here with confirming the judges, that Supreme Court ruling in the state of Colorado was divided 4-3 among 7 judges who were all appointed by Democrats. Yet the Supreme Court, you have a 6-3 conservative majority. My guess is that they'll see it the other way. I think what would be good for the country is if the court, being the Supreme Court, did not rule along those ideological lines, that they sort of came to a unanimous decision sort of based on the lack of due process, as well as I think the intent of the Constitution to allow voters to decide who their elected representatives should be rather than again, politically appointed judges. So again, I think I would be surprised if the Supreme Court did not end up that way. In terms of the impact, like I think it probably bolsters Trump's case in the Republican primary. You've already seen
No
sort
doubt
of
about it.
a
I mean,
rally
these guys
around
just
the
don't see it, do they? They just don't see it. It just
well, even for his opponents, I mean, they have to sort of come to his defense, and that's sort of been one of the, I think, challenging things. I know that there was a lot of attention paid, at least on liberal media, to a comment made by Ron DeSantis. Does he have any regrets in terms of his campaign? And I think one of the things that he sort of signaled out was, yeah, I regret that Trump was indicted because it sort of sucked up all the oxygen in the room. And people have been critical of his campaign, but if you just look at where the polling averages were prior to that initial indictment, and sort of where they've been since and sustained from that point, he may have an argument there.
so the town over from where I am, back in the day, 1880s, there was they locked a guy up for crimes against children, as you can imagine what that was, and a big angry mob, came and went to the sheriff and demanded his release so they could basically, enact justice in the streets. The sheriff refused, so they just burned down the jail with him in it. So there is some precedent here in Colorado for doing things, old school, I guess, but I don't think we're
Dis-
quite at that point.
Dispensing justice outside the courts. Some would like to get back to that in some ways.
Yeah, no doubt. Neil, in terms of what else we're seeing out there, with the confidence and all, what's on the docket between now and the end of the year in terms of data that we need to pay attention to?
There's really nothing coming out of consequence. I mean, we have the home price data from Case-Shiller that'll be out, and then we'll get data on pending home sales. But I mean, as you know, I mean, you've looked at the home builders. You know what's going on in the housing market. It's responding to the drop in mortgage rates. So yeah, I mean, should be a relatively quiet week. But when we come back in the new year, it's gonna heat right back up.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, we'll get the first week, we'll get the employment data back, we'll get the ISMs back. So no doubt, take a little lull, but we'll be right back at it. We've got a call on the 4th of January for our Outlook call, so join us for that for sure. Steve, real quick, this U.S. Steel, an institution, the Carnegies. I mean, it is robber baron and USA as it comes.
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan, here we go, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is as thick as it gets. What's kind of the outlook on this, and how big are the impediments to this merger?
Well, you sort of mentioned it's an iconic company, and if you look at it where it's headquartered there, obviously in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh is very influential in determining how Pennsylvania, also a very significant battleground state, will go at the presidential level. On top of that, you have Democratic Senator Bob Casey facing re-election there in 2024 against a pretty formidable Republican challenger in David McCormick, who will not lack for resources there. And then you have Senator Sherrod Brown representing Ohio. And I think Brown's reelection is really going to be important to Democrats maintaining control of the Senate. And they're sort of, I think, applying a lot of political pressure here on the Biden administration, calling for a CFIUS, Committee for Foreign Investment, United States review overseen by the Treasury Department to sort of look at, national security concerns. Now, I think on the surface, some people would say, well, this is going to Japan, a powerful ally. Is this really a national security concern? But, we've seen sort of this expansion of that definition between national and economic security, mostly applied to the technology sector. But you might recall that it was a Section 232 steel tariffs under the Trump administration. Trump sort of took a different approach than Biden. His approach was more, tariffs to try to bolster U.S. Production in sensitive industries. And Biden, I think, has gone more the subsidy route, but still this protectionist desire. I think that theme's going to continue. So my guess is, in the White House, you saw Lael Brainerd come out yesterday, I think sort of put a thumb on the scale. We'll see if CFIUS does reach a decision here to sort of question the deal. And if so, does that create an opportunity for Cleveland Cliffs? They had made a deal, I believe, in August, was maybe not as attractive as the one made by Nippon. But Cleveland Cliffs, surprisingly, or not surprisingly rather, is located Cleveland, Ohio, Sherrod Brown. So we all work for somebody. So something to watch there.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Well, in terms of the equity markets, yields will remain important, but going in the right direction, as Neil points out. 450 is the upside resistance there. There is sensitivity. There's a lot of S&P sensitivity to those yields. So I think we're somewhere between 350 and 450 in the 2024 outlook. So we'll keep an eye on that. But within that, that should keep the narrative for equities still more favorable than not. Well, Merry Christmas, everybody, and Happy New Year, but we'll be back again with you next week. Again, I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
We'll see you.